rare wine sold to billionaire Bill Koch for $2 million. It was a record-breaking sale. But what the billionaire didn't know was that his new bottles were forgeries. At the same time, Rudy Kurniawan was over the moon. He had mixed the wines himself in his cluttered California kitchen from cheap bottles, the forgeries so perfect that they could fool the most elite palates on the planet. And when they didn't, they'd be too embarrassed to admit that they had been duped, or so he hoped. It was the perfect scam. But the more he sold, the more arrogant he became, even appearing on the news as a credible wine fraud expert, warning people about fake wines flooding the market, without mentioning, of course, that he was the one making them. It added to his air of legitimacy. Still, he knew it was beyond risky. One mistake and these billionaires could ruin his life. Every one of the fake wines had to be beyond perfect. But Rudy was confident. He had spent years within these elite circles, building a reputation as a wine prodigy, and now he was ready to abuse it. The wine scene in California in the early 2000s was dominated by boring old wine collectors. We're talking elitist boomers, swirling their wine glasses, giving it a sniff, and flexing their palate. But then Rudy showed up, young, charming, and somehow always bragging about having tasted the rarest bottles in the room.
Are you independently wealthy?
No, I'm broke.
No, I'm trying to...
I scam people to drink their wines.
Bottles that seem to be impossible to acquire. We're talking about unicorn wines, legendary vintages, stuff that no one had seen in decades. And no one could figure out where it was all coming from. But this got him into a private wine tasting group called the Angry Men's Club, a sort of fight club for billionaires with wine cellars. Once a month, they all got together, and one guy would bring an astoundingly rare bottle, sometimes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, while everyone else just brought junk wines. Hence, he'd be the angry man. Rudy, when hosting, always impressed with a rare vintage. But he had another talent too. He had the best palate of any of them, could break a wine down like a chemist, pinpoint specific grapes, regions, dissect exactly what went into it and when. And to wine enthusiasts, the only way to acquire this skill was to have tasted thousands of bottles. It added to his mystique. Within the California wine scene, he became stuff of legend. Soon enough, everyone knew his name. They wanted him at their parties, and he was inviting them to his own. But no one really knew him. People wonder what his background was, where he came from, how he got into wine. People were assuming that he must have come from an incredibly rich family in Asia. There was even rumors that his family owned all of the Heineken distribution for China. Rudy himself would tell people that he was on a $1 million month allowance to buy wine, and people would see him spending this at auctions. It was no secret. But otherwise, when asked about his family or personal life, he completely shut down, said it's private, refused to elaborate. Rudy was a complete mystery. Even his name wasn't totally legit. Rudy Kurniawan, who was so close to a famous Indonesian badminton player. The crazy thing is, all this mystery surrounding him actually made him even more popular. He was just as mysterious and exclusive as the wine bottles they collected. For a few people though, it was strange. They knew him in the early days, or were at least aware of him, before he was hosting these private wine tastings or rubbing shoulders with celebrities, before his spending exploded at auctions. Back when Rudy was just a quiet guy at the back of wine auctions, buying cheap bottles, watching, studying. But now, by the time he was hosting his own auctions, they wonder, how did this guy go from that to selling millions of dollars in wine? And to answer that question, we have to go way back to Jakarta, Indonesia.
When we drink wine, we don't look at the price value, you know, we look at what we get from the wine, the excitement, you know.
Rudy was born on October 10th, 1976 in Jakarta, Indonesia, into a Chinese family at a time when that was a dangerous thing to be. His real name wasn't Rudy. It was Zhen Wang Wang. But in Indonesia, being ethnically Chinese meant you were treated like a second-class citizen. See, 10 years before he was born, the government had pushed a law that encouraged Chinese Indonesians to adopt local-sounding names. This was out of fear of communism and foreign influence, so his dad went with this name, but it didn't fix anything. The discrimination didn't go away. To ensure their safety, Rudy's family lived in a walled compound. Not wanting Rudy to live in constant fear, they sent him away to Singapore for his schooling. But throughout his childhood, it just seemed like he never really had a true home. He was too Chinese for Indonesia and too Indonesian for China. all that he really had was his family. Once he graduated high school, Rudy followed his brother to California. At first, he went to university in Sacramento, but then transferred to California State at Northridge to finish his degree. He lived with his brother the whole time. After Rudy graduated, he stayed in California, doing odd accounting jobs here and there, but beneath it all, he was already hiding something, because Rudy's student visa had expired. He was staying in the US illegally. He couldn't leave without risking being barred from coming back. And he desperately wanted to go back home to his mom and dad, but by the time the severe ethnic riots against the Chinese broke out in Indonesia and Rudy's mother fled to live in America with them, he was locked in. Unfortunately, Rudy's father never came. He decided to remain overseas for his business, but he was privileged enough to have the resources to visit America often. And it was on one of these visits in 1999 that Rudy discovered his passion for wine. Rudy was throwing his dad a birthday celebration at the San Francisco Fisherman's Wharf. To treat his dad, he decided to buy him the most expensive wine on the menu, a 1996 Opus wine. Rudy had never really tried wine before. He was only about 22 years old at the time, and grape wines aren't as popular in Asia as they are in America. But when he had that first sip, boy did he fall in love. It was like nothing he ever had before. It was acidic and intense, yet layered with delicate flavors. He was obsessed. Following that party, Rudy started purchasing wines from a local wine dealer in the LA area. He would buy a bunch of bottles, take them home, and then try them one by one, comparing the different flavor profiles of each wine. But then tragedy struck. In 2000, Rudy's father died. Now, Rudy had nothing left in Indonesia. Any thoughts of moving back there now made no sense. His only family, his mom and his brother, were in America. And to cope, he would focus all his attention on this new passion. Rudy started to attend local wine tastings at Red Carpet Liquor, an old liquor store in LA that actually was one of the filming locations for the movie Crazy Stupid Love. Rudy, being only in his early 20s at the time, was often the youngest person there. We know the hobby is basically an old boys club, but he was young, charismatic, and most importantly, a tasting prodigy. People noticed that he was unbelievably accurate in his wine palate, and this got him a lot of attention. I think he got addicted to the attention because it allowed him to hang out with these mind-numbingly wealthy people and be the center of their focus. But having a good palate and attending local wine tastings wasn't enough to really cement him within this community. He wasn't getting invited to the parties just yet. He had to prove his worth, get more integrated into the community. So Rudy started attending and bidding in wine auctions. At first, there was a few $1,000s here and there, but by 2003, his spending exploded. Millions of dollars a year on wine. Nobody knew exactly where the money was coming from. I have some ideas. There's some secrets about his family that couldn't have been traced back through his assumed last name. See, Rudy wasn't the first fraudster in his family. His uncle, Hendra Raharja, was a well-connected banker back in Indonesia. In the late 90s, he siphoned a reported $600 million out of Bank Harapan Sentosa. It was one of the biggest financial scandals in the country's history. He fled to Australia, lived in luxury until he died of a heart attack in 2003 while fighting extradition. He never faced trial, never paid a cent back. Another uncle, Eddie Tansel, pulled the big dirty too, embezzled $420 million from a state-run bank, got sentenced to 17 years. But after only serving 2, in 1996, he escaped through bribes. Then, in 1998, a report came out that he was running a beer company in China. Indonesia has tried to get him extradited with no luck. Today, he is thought to be living in Macau, but a beer company? That's really curious. I mean, this guy would have the connections for labels, bottles, corks that could be useful for someone trying to manufacture fake knockoffs of rare wines. As for Rudy's dad, he was running some sort of importation business, but as far as I can tell, there's no real public information on exactly what the business activities were. Indonesian business records are scattered. He certainly wasn't the face of like a big public company though. But this is the kind of family that Rudy came from. Bank scammers that knew how to embezzle and disappear when they needed to. But of course, the wine snobs weren't looking this deep. Some just assumed that it was family wealth, others didn't ask. But because he was spending so much on wine, he started to get invited to more and more high-end wine tastings with even more affluent guests. The more expensive the wine, the more attention he received, and the more his reputation kept spreading. He got more access, started to be invited to private dinners, better wine, bigger names. He even started hosting his own parties. One birthday dinner he threw for his mom had Jackie Chan there as a guest who stood up and personally toasted Rudy. According to Rudy, that was the best night of his life. But the more wine Rudy bought, he started started realizing that he was coming across quite a lot of forgeries. Counterfeiting has actually been a problem in the vintage wine world for a long time. Basically, every collector knew that somewhere in their wine cellar, there was a few forged bottles that they don't know about, just waiting to be discovered. But it was kind of part of the sport. These wines are decades, sometimes centuries old. Many of the people who enjoyed the wines originally are long gone. Likewise, the memory of how those wines tasted has been completely lost to time. That meant that it was almost impossible to truly authenticate a rare wine bottle. And if you decided that you wanted to, you'd have to go and find multiple different experts that specialize in different parts of the bottle. The labels, the wax, the cork, the glass. Every part of the wine had to be examined, and this takes a lot of time, energy, money. Most collectors, they were hoping that the auction houses had done their due diligence for them. When people actually did find fakes in their collection, they'd keep it to themselves. Usually they would simply put it back on the market, hoping that some other poor fool would take it off their hands. Or if they had only noticed after opening it and pouring a glass, they would brag about how bad the fake was, how it didn't get past them, how it tastes nothing like the real version they had enjoyed before. The truth was, while they may have lost thousands of dollars, the majority of those involved in this hobby, they're wealthy, they're drinking it right, and so they don't care about the money. Well, that's not totally true. Some people do invest into wine, hoping that it'll appreciate in value over the years, and of course, if a bunch of fakes are flooding the market, it's counterproductive to that. So there's a small group that really do look at bottles with a critical eye. That being said, not all counterfeit wine was created equal. For Rudy, he knew that a few fakes were bound to slip into his collection. It was part of the game, and honestly, he was fine with that. But what bothered him the most was when he opened a bottle and found garbage. Fakes filled with cheap bottom shelf wine or just dyed water. Some of them even had bits of trash and debris floating inside. And to someone like Rudy, who genuinely cared about the taste, that was unforgivable. And he knew this was a sloppy job because they could have blended different wines together to make it pass as if it was the real thing. But whoever was making these must have lacked the palate to do so. And Rudy knew he could do better. But he didn't want to dupe the community that had pulled him out of his slump. Something was going to need to push him to do that. Speaking of crimes, not knowing how to code in 2025 is a big one. That's where today's sponsor comes in, BootDev. With BootDev, it's easier than ever to learn backend web development in Python and Go. Their platform teaches you the fundamentals the right way by getting your hands on the keyboard and writing a ton of code. It's set up like a role-playing game that tracks your progress with quests, achievements, XPs, and levels, so you have an endless amount of dopamine to keep you going, while at the same time preparing yourself for a potential new career path at your own pace. A true testament to their platform is how active their Discord server is. You can always get in there and ask for help. They've also got the AI wizard bear that's trained on each lesson, and he can help you get unstuck using the Socratic teaching method. So he'll ask you questions that will lead you towards the answer without just giving it away so you actually learn. Better yet, if you're not totally sure that coding is right for you, don't worry, because there's a free demo of every course and its interactive features, plus a 30-day, no questions asked refund policy to get your money back. So go to boot.dev to try out the course for free. Then use my code CRUMB to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. That's an amazing deal by an amazing company. Thank you, BootDev. Before Rudy ever faked the label, he was playing games with the market. By this time, his spending at auctions had ramped up. He wanted to be a big player. Part of it was building his own collection. Part of it was to acquire rare wines for the Angry Men's Club. But Rudy wasn't just collecting. He was also manipulating the market. He'd find a vintage that he liked, maybe one with a decent reputation but not too much heat on it. Then he'd buy every single bottle he could get his hands on, drained the auctions dry. Suddenly, collectors who once ignored the wine started noticing that it was nowhere to be found. Scarcity created buzz. People assumed that it was about to spike in value because why else would someone be buying them all? Then a few weeks later, Rudy would flip the exact same bottles back to the auction house he bought them from, only this time for a much higher price. The auction house would hype it up as a sleeper vintage, exploding in value, and rich collectors, desperate to not miss out, would bid it up even further. Nothing illegal about this. It's actually pretty smart, but despite creating artificial scarcity, Rudy was starting to run into some scarcity problems of his own. The Angry Men's Club and other wine tasting events he would attend and host, well, he had built a reputation of impressing, and it was becoming harder and harder for Rudy to actually find real authentic rare bottles of wine. And he felt like he needed rare finds if he wanted to stay relevant. By this time, Rudy also had adopted the image that he was an expert on fake wines.
You know, you always want to be careful with these online auctions because you never know the provenance. They just want to sell.
can
Sometimes
return
if they doubt the bottle, they put the picture of it. So you be the judge.
Okay.
You look at the picture, you want it, you take it, you need it.
Naturally, buying so much, he had many fakes in his own collection. But as he was looking at them, he realized he could do better. Could manufacture a collection of fake vintages that any collector would dream of. First, he started saving empty wine bottles from different tastings. Then, using his incredible palate, would fill them with newer, less expensive wines, blending them together to taste almost identical to that of the original. Other times, he would buy partially filled bottles and recondition them. Reconditioning is like a legitimate technique used by the original chateaus, that's the wineries, in which they take a wine bottle that's already been opened and partially filled and then top it up with wines of the same or newer vintage to protect the wine from oxidization. The bottle is then recorked and sometimes rewaxed, but always labeled with a note or a stamp indicating that it's been reconditioned. Importantly, this has to happen by the original winery. Collectors typically do not recondition bottles themselves because it would immediately call into question the wine's authenticity. But Rudy knew no one was gonna know. These are the low-hanging grapes, if you will, of the wine faking world, refilling bottles, and this is how Rudy got his start, mainly to expand his personal wine cellar and remain relevant. Occasionally, he would sell off a few bottles here and there, but at the time, he wasn't exactly known as a huge wine seller. And we see this at parties. Rudy would pull out the bottle, take the first taste, and say, "Oh, this is a fake."
Really, it's hard. A big bottle is Koch, man. No, I'm just kidding. I love doing that shit. Yeah.
But he's just tricking everyone there. I don't know if this bottle in this clip is a fake, but if it was, man, that's a level of arrogance. Either way, Rudy got away with this, and I'm sure that gave him a level of confidence, but it was still small-scale stuff. Soon, it was going to spiral into a full-on production, having fake bottles, labels, corks, and seals manufactured to fake millions of dollars in the rarest wines at an industrial scale, because Rudy was about to meet a man named John Kapon. Acker, Merrill & Condit is a wine store in New York, one of the oldest in America, founded in 1820. But when John Kapon took over from his dad, he wanted to shake things up, modernize it, and he had a plan: fine wine auctions. These could be insanely lucrative. Auction houses could take anywhere from 5 to 20% in fees, sometimes on both sides of the deal. But there was one problem. At the time, Acker was the lowest ranked auction house in the world. If John wanted to compete with the giants like Sotheby's or Christie's, he needed a show-stopping auction, someone with a world-class collection willing to sell it off. Luckily for John, he knew just the man, Rudy. So John started asking him, subtle at first. Finally, Rudy bid, but not to do a public auction, just a few small private sales that Acker was going to facilitate. This is where Rudy would meet Bill Koch, a billionaire heir to an oil empire. This guy seriously had a cellar in his house that looks like a museum. 43,000 bottles in this thing. Many historic and priceless, of course. Actually, at many of the auctions that Rudy was attending, one of Bill's representatives would be right next to him trying to outbid him. Often it came down to Rudy and Bill Koch's representative. But now, Rudy was selling off a few of the bottles, many real, some fake, and it went well. But for John, who had no idea, this still wasn't good enough. He needed Rudy to do something bigger, a public auction with thousands of bottles. In 2006, Rudy finally agreed, and on April 25th, it finally came to life. Acker called it the Cellar, a once-in-a-generation wine collection. The catalog over 1,000 pages, and boy, were these auctions special, because John treated them like a giant party. They were rowdy, loud, boozy, guys screaming across the room, drowning vintages mid-bid. At one point, John had to pipe up and say, "Hey, shut the heck up," so he could keep calling out the auctions. And the people loved it. He was an amazing seller, paired with an even more amazing collection. They made $24.7 million in a single night. Acker exploded overnight. They went from bottom of the barrel, literally last in the rankings, to the #1 wine auction house in the world. John started getting interviews on the news.
He is the CEO of Acker, Merrill & Condit. And this year, he has auctioned off more than $100 million, the first wine house to do so. John Kapon joining me. So you can't whine about that revenue, right? Get it, wine. John, you're going to leave now, aren't you? All right, well, it's been a pretty crazy...
And for Rudy, it turned him from a collector into a kingmaker. He had literally made Acker. And now, John had to keep him around by any means possible. For a while, their partnership looked unstoppable. Between Rudy's collection and John's marketing, they moved $35 million worth of wine, over 14,000 bottles just in 2006 through a series of auctions. What Rudy told everyone was that most of the wines in his lot were purchased from prior auctions, that they'd been sitting in his cellar untouched. And this was true for thousands of the bottles, but for thousands more, they had been faked. He had long since expanded past just refilling old bottles. He was now manufacturing them almost from the ground up. He had deals with restaurants to send him their empties, would tell them that they were for different photo shoots. Whenever he was attending tastings and parties, he insisted on bringing the empties home, and his excuse was he liked to write notes on them so he could remember what they tasted like. But Rudy was actually taking all of these bottles he was sourcing and soaking them in his kitchen sink to remove the old labels. He had partnered up with someone he knew in Indonesia to print off authentic reproductions of labels and stickers for more expensive wines. He would then carefully apply those by hand to his soaked bottles, fill them up with a mix of other wines that would taste very close to what it was supposed to contain, and then finally recork them using a period-accurate cork and wax seal, using a specially made stamp to match the original. These recreations were so accurate, it was nearly impossible to tell them apart from a real bottle without advanced forensics. It was clear that Rudy was putting a lot of time and effort into this. Absolutely nobody noticed that many of these bottles in the 2006 auctions were actually just made in his kitchen. And since their relationship was going so well, John started offering Rudy loans in advance on future wine auctions, millions in cash lent out for bottles to be sold at a later date. This is actually a tactic often used by auction houses. For Acker and John, it was a guarantee that Rudy kept selling the wine with them instead of going to another auction house. But it also put a lot of pressure on Rudy. There was uncertainty around what the bottles would actually sell for. He could end up owing Acker money. He would promise them bottles that he didn't actually have made yet. And Rudy, now more than ever, actually needed the money, because being the young wine prodigy wasn't cheap. Rudy had got caught up in playing the part, trying to keep up with the actual billionaires he was surrounded by. He was buying luxury cars, including a Bugatti. He got himself a very nice mansion, was spending tens of thousands on these dinners he was hosting, suits, watches, the whole shebang. He got carried away, was spending it faster than he was making it, faster than he could get it on loan. Acker was keeping him afloat. But by 2007, it seems that his bank ran dry. He owed millions to Acker, his source of funds from his family seems to have been cut off, so he starts asking for loans from his incredibly wealthy wine-loving friends. And when they don't immediately give him some cash, he sways them with some rare bottles of wine. But even these weren't enough. He took out another $3 million with Fine Art Capital, completely lied on the application, claimed that he didn't owe any other loans, but at this time he actually owed around $11.5 million. And as collateral, Rudy put up 25 pieces of priceless art that he had probably bought with more loan money. But none of this was enough. Rudy needed more money to maintain his lifestyle inflation. So it's around this time that he goes back to John, gives him a list of wines, an astoundingly rare collection, ones that to John probably seemed like Rudy had been holding on to, but now that he was desperate, he was going to let them go. They set the auction date for April 25th, 2008. 1 year away. It was going to be the most impressive auction yet. But now came the hard part, because Rudy didn't actually have any of these wines. He had to make all of them within the year. And so he was going to spend the entirety of 2007 creating fake bottle after fake bottle to bring to that auction. Meanwhile, Bill had just discovered something that was going to put more attention than ever on Rudy. In 2006, while Rudy was busy pasting on fake labels in his kitchen, Bill discovered that his collection was contaminated. He had bought 4 bottles of wine, supposedly owned by Thomas Jefferson, for $100,000 apiece through a well-respected auction house sold by someone other than Rudy. Auction houses are meant to do their due diligence in ensuring that the bottles are real, but after buying them, Bill discovered that they were clearly fakes. Under a microscope, it was found that the name had been etched into the glass using a modern-day Dremel. Bill didn't like being duped, and now he wondered if these fakes had made it into his cellar, what else could be hiding down there? So he hired a team of private investigators, literally ex-FBI agents, forensic experts, wine historians, to inspect every single bottle that he owned. And what they found? Glue that didn't exist in the 1800s, labels that came off laser printers before laser printers ever existed, bottles with vintages that wineries had never even produced. By the end of the audit, Bill's team had flagged over 400 bottles as confirmed counterfeits, worth more than $4 million. And while the vast majority of these weren't tied to Rudy, he certainly got Bill's attention, because 5 of the fake bottles were, and he had just recently purchased them through those private sales that Acker was making with Rudy to Bill. And so Bill had his people file lawsuits against Rudy and Acker. He wanted the money back. But still, it wasn't clear to Bill if Rudy was just a victim himself. I mean, Bill still had 395 more fake bottles in his collection. Surely Rudy would have accidentally acquired some fakes too, since he was a serious collector. There was plausible deniability here. But what's important is that Bill wanted answers to where these fake bottles were coming from in the first place, and he would be looking towards Rudy to give him information on where he acquired these fake bottles. Meanwhile, Rudy wasn't slowing down. None of this scared him. If anything, he was trying to outdo himself to meet the demand for his upcoming blowout auction. Because the hype around his collections meant that every new auction had to be bigger, louder, more outrageous, plus he needed the money really bad. And under that pressure, he started getting sloppy. 107 bottles of wine from Domaine Ponceau were supposed to be the centerpiece, but some of the bottles were off. Labels with years for when they were supposedly made that couldn't have been possible. Somewhere along the way, he had messed up his research. Rudy was actually using computers quite heavily to make these fakes, researching labels, recreating the designs, but the internet in 2008, well, maybe he read a Wikipedia article with some bad information. But the auction house hadn't noticed. And these are big productions to put together. As they got closer and closer to the date, the wines were taken in, each one photographed and then put together into a massive auction brochure, showing each wine in detail, then sent out to attract buyers. Still, no one noticed the impossible wines. Till one of those catalogs made it into the hands of French winemaker Laurent Ponceau. Remember, the centerpiece of this auction was 107 bottles of wine from Domaine Ponceau, Laurent's family winery. Laurent is the 4th generation head of Domaine Ponceau, a historic Burgundy estate that has been producing some of the rarest and most sought-after wines in the world for over 150 years. This was his family's history, and boy, did he know it well. So when he saw 107 bottles in Rudy's auction, he studied the listings closely because immediately things weren't adding up. First, Laurent spotted a 1929 Clos de la Roche. One problem, Domaine Ponceau didn't start estate bottling until 1934. Then he noticed several bottles of Clos Saint-Denis, allegedly vintaged from the 40s through the 70s, but Domaine didn't even make these wines until 1982. Laurent was beyond offended. This wasn't just a bottle or two of fakes, this was over $600,000 worth of wine. Because after close examination, he found that all 107 bottles were totally fake. At first, he called Acker, informing them that there were multiple fraudulent bottles for auction in their next lot. But then, a little voice in his head said that Acker wasn't going to take him seriously. Didn't seem like they were going to pull them from the auction. So he hopped on the next plane from France to New York, just to make sure that nobody would get scammed. He sat at the back of the auction room. Nobody noticed that he was there, but the room was rowdy, packed with wealthy bidders. They were all drinking. But when the first bottle of Ponceau went up for auction, Laurent stood up. He demanded that every single one of his bottles be withdrawn. The room went silent. John Kapon was stunned. Then, reluctantly, he slammed the gravel. They removed the bottles from the auction. For Rudy, this was a disaster beyond embarrassing. Ponceau, the family heir, was there in person, calling him out for putting fake wines to auction. At the time, nobody knew where these fake bottles came from, but Rudy somehow had them, and a lot of them, and put them up. And so gossip naturally spiraled out of control throughout the wine community. Everyone began to wonder if the wines they shared over the years with Rudy were even real. If Rudy was willing to fake Ponceau, one of the most revered names in Burgundy, what else had he faked? But still, no one was quite sure because they still didn't know where the bottles came from. And Rudy would start making some pretty good excuses. Nothing had been proven, but for Laurent, he was going to get to the bottom of it. The next day, Laurent invited Rudy out for lunch. His idea was to treat Rudy like a friend, thinking it would make it easier to get information out of him. He asked Rudy point blank, where did the wines come from? Rudy squirmed, tried to dodge the question, apparently looked incredibly uncomfortable, like he had been caught in a lie. Said he didn't know that he buys so much wine that he'll need to check his records and get back to him. Laurent knew that this was all he would get for now, but that was okay because he was going to play the long game. He was going to become Rudy's best friend in hopes to get more information out of him later. Meanwhile, he was actually forming an internal investigation team, one that would butt up with Bill Cook's team after discovering they had been looking into fakes and had sued Rudy. With Bill's money and Laurent's determination, the investigators gained access to the wine community's inner circles, emails, auction records, private notes, everything they could find on Rudy. First, they discovered what we know: he wasn't a resident, that his student visa had long expired, and that he was actually living in the US with a warrant out for his arrest. Digging even deeper, the team uncovered an old letter to Homeland Security listing the family business Rudy and his brother had used to originally enter the country and obtain a visa. When investigators went to that address in Jakarta, it wasn't some fancy import-export company, it was a row of small shops, and specifically, the one listed on the visa application was a hardware store. They went door to door and asked every shop owner here if they knew or had heard of Rudy or his father, but nobody had any idea. Another dead end. 2 months later, Rudy emailed Laurent. He claimed that he had finally tracked down the source of the wines, a mysterious Jakarta collector named Pak Hendra. Laurent flew to Los Angeles to meet Rudy face to face after getting this email. Over dinner, he pressed him more. Tell me, Rudy, who is this Pak Hendra? How did you meet him? Where does he come from? Rudy scribbled 2 Indonesian phone numbers on a napkin and slid them across the table. The next day, Laurent tried them both. The first was a fax machine and the second rang dead. But he handed them off to his investigation team. An ex-CIA officer ran a trace. The first number? Lion Air, Indonesia's largest airline. Not exactly a big mysterious wine collector. The second, a strip mall. The same mysterious old address on Rudy's visa paperwork. Everything about Rudy's story kept coming up fake. They couldn't figure out who this guy was, so Laurent decided to go to Asia himself, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taipei, because wealthy Indonesians often travel to these spots. And at different tastings and dinner, Laurent, who knew many of them, would ask about Rudy and the strange name. Eventually, he learned that Pak is like Mr. and Hendra is like Smith. Rudy had literally given him the name Mr. Smith. And no one knew of a rich Jakarta family with a son in America selling rare wines who supposedly owned a Heineken distribution business. Laurent was at a complete loss, and it's at this point that he called in the big guns. FBI agent James Wynn, a veteran of art fraud cases. His background is in finance, and he thought this, in a lot of ways, is a financial crime, that he would find the truth by tracing the money. After reviewing Rudy's bank account records, he didn't find any true source of funds coming in. What he did find was Rudy was borrowing lots and lots of money, delaying payments, paying people off with one loan while taking out another. While all of this was unfolding in the background, Rudy was having a heck of a time trying to sell his wines because of the Acker expose. But Rudy still needed money, clearly. So he started using straw sellers, people willing to sell his wines under their name to get into auction houses. And other times, the auction houses just didn't care. In 2009, for example, Christie sold wine in a series of auctions for him under his own name. Collectors were quite upset by this. The auction houses had gone from having high reputations to having sold tens of millions in counterfeit wine. By now, collectors and online sleuths were on high alert, dissecting every catalog photo. Fake after fake surfaced. For example, one of the wines Rudy had listed had a label with a misspelling. Then there was all the classic telltale signs like the wax he was using and the specific printer labels, and investigators were collecting all of this to use against him. Then, in 2011, they finally managed to get Rudy in for a deposition through a suit followed by Bill Koch. They were able to interview Rudy about fake wines that Bill had bought off another seller, but had originated from Rudy.
Can you please state your name for the record?
Rudy Kurniawan. We basically drank a lot of these bottles with a lot of different people, including critics, experts, auction houses, and whatnot. It could be counterfeit, but he's not sure. I'm not sure. I don't believe so. So I agreed to take them back, which is the right thing to do.
Yeah, they learned nothing new. He basically denied everything and acted very hospitable, like he was willing to take them back. And despite all this stuff going on, it doesn't seem like Rudy was ever truly worried about it all coming crashing down. The next year, in February 2012, Don Cornwell noticed an auction being held by Spectrum Wine Auctions with millions of dollars in fake wine for sale. clearly made by Rudy based on the photos. It had all the telltale signs. And so Don, not knowing what to do, made a warning post on a very popular online wine forum, informing other collectors not to fall prey to this. And it went crazy viral. This, combined with the mountain of evidence collected by Bill and Laurent, gave the FBI exactly what they needed: probable cause. They were going to raid Rudy's mansion. After 5 years under investigation, the FBI finally made its move. At dawn, agents surrounded Rudy's Arcadia mansion. They knocked some more, then started shouting, but nothing. Rudy was nowheres to be found. The team leader called for the ram, but just as they were about to smash the door, it swung open. Rudy stood there, dazed, like he had just rolled out of bed. He was immediately put under arrest. But what the agents found when they went inside, they couldn't believe. The living room was littered with wine bottles and housed a giant oversized wine refrigerator. But it wasn't until they walked into the kitchen that they realized Rudy was truly running a counterfeiting factory. There was bottles soaking in the sink, labels half peeled off. Next to it was a lineup of bottles waiting for labels to be applied. There was a cork extraction tool, a recorking press, a makeshift mixing station with rows of California wines, each tagged with handwritten notes. Because remember, Rudy was mixing these together to make them taste like the wine he was imitating. Nearby, there was unlabeled bottles with formulas written on in chalk. Then boxes with thousands of counterfeit labels stacked next to old wooden crates that he would ship his fake wines in. The thermostat was even set at like 63 degrees to keep the wine cold, while he kept a space heater in his bedroom so he could stay warm. And in the spare rooms, they found racks and racks of wine. On a treadmill, there was even 18 bottles waiting to be labeled. Then they found boxes with actual real labels from rare wines used as a sort of reference library to recreate the fakes. It was everything you would need to create the perfect fake wine collection. One FBI agent said if he could have made a wish list of 10 pieces of evidence, this was 10 times that. The absolute motherlode. And it didn't stop there. Agents also discovered thousands of dollars worth of imported wax, special antique style paper for labels, of course, all the empty bottles he had been collecting from high-end restaurants under the guise of creating a museum / doing photo shoots. And searching his computer, they could see that Rudy had been scanning real labels and reprinting them on a massive high-res printer he had purchased. The myth of Rudy was over. Rudy was taken to a detention center in New York City, deemed a flight risk, and denied bail. A year later, after sitting in a cell, December 2013, he faced trial in a Manhattan federal court. Prosecutors charged him with mail and wire fraud, not just for faking wines, but for the millions he had conned through auction loans backed by those bottles. In court, they painted him as a kind of mad scientist. Evidence showed his tasting notes, blending formulas, and mock-ups for legendary vintages. The U.S. Marshals displayed over 500 counterfeit bottles seized from his home, the largest wine seizure in U.S. history. He was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, ordered to forfeit over $20 million and pay $28.5 million more in restitution to his victims. He became the first person in U.S. history ever convicted of wine fraud. They estimate between 2002 and 2012, Rudy sold 12,000 bottles at auction for a staggering $35 million. Collectors like Bill had spent millions on Rudy's wines, but the feds never did find an original source of funds. They suspected that the infamous $1 million wine allowance that he bragged about in the early days might have trickled down from his family's history, all those big bank heists, but they were never able to find any concrete proof of that happening. Since Rudy's conviction, the wine industry has tightened its security. Auction houses are far more cautious. For what it's worth, ACCA refunded people for the fake bottles sold, but this was largely due to a 2014 settlement obligating them to do so. Experts estimate that thousands of Rudy's fakes are still out there, quietly sitting in private collections. And the ones that they did manage to confiscate from his personal home, well, the Department of Justice smashed them. This is crazy footage. They didn't want the bottles to be empty and then reused by another wine fraudster. Fast forward to today. After serving 7 years, Rudy was released in November 2020. ICE deported him back to Indonesia in April 2021, but instead of laying low, Rudy returned to the spotlight. He's since been hosting exclusive tastings in Singapore and Hong Kong, creating his fake versions of legendary wines for people to taste at a fraction of the price. Apparently, many of the guests even prefer his versions over the original. And within the wine community, since time has passed, Rudy is kind of celebrated as a sort of savant. It wasn't anyone that could have pulled this off. He truly was a tasting genius.